They laughed when she said the boy was still there. The senior physicians in Cleveland's most prestigious ward didn't just dismiss Mariah Dells. They performed her erasure with smirks and shared glances, as if her 22 years and trainee badge made her incapable of sight. 8-year-old Toby Mason had been declared neurologically absent for 72 hours. Yet something in his fingers called to her with a warmth no thermometer registered. When she whispered that his eyelids had moved, the room erupted in patronizing sympathy for her inexperience. But the child opened his eyes when she touched him, and the silence that followed shattered every assumption in that sterile room. Subscribe to witness the moment the invisible became undeniable. The fluorescent lights in the pediatric intensive care wing of Cleveland General hummed with a frequency that seemed designed to strip away hope, casting everything in a bluish pallor that made even the living look half-departed. Mariah Dells stood outside room 347 with her clipboard pressed against her chest like a shield, her fingers trembling just enough that the papers rustled with each shallow breath she took. She had been standing there for 11 minutes, watching through the narrow window as Dr. Grayson Chen and his team of senior physicians moved around the bed of Toby Mason with the practiced choreography of people who had already written the ending to this story. Their white coats swished with authority, their voices carried the weight of decades and published papers, and their eyes never once drifted toward the doorway where the trainee nurse hovered like an uncertain ghost. Mariah had learned in her first week that invisibility was the default state for someone wearing the pale green scrubs of a student, that her presence registered somewhere between the IV poles and the monitoring equipment, functional, necessary in theory, but ultimately beneath notice. The hallway smelled of antiseptic and resignation, and somewhere down the corridor a child was crying for their mother. The sound muffled by closed doors, but still piercing enough to make Mariah's throat tighten, with an empathy she hadn't yet learned to shield herself from. She knew she should enter the room, should perform the basic vital checks that were within her limited scope of practice, but the memory of yesterday's incident kept her feet planted on the threshold of action and paralysis. Yesterday, she had suggested to nurse practitioner Sandra Whitmore that the sedation schedule for a post-operative patient in room 351 might be causing the child's increased agitation rather than addressing it, and Sandra had looked at her with the kind of exhausted patience usually reserved for very small children who ask why the sky is blue. The other nurses had been there. Bethany with her 15 years of experience, Marcus with his casual competence that made everything look effortless, and Jennifer who had a way of sighing that communicated entire paragraphs of disappointment. Sandra had explained, in a voice that somehow managed to be both gentle and cutting, that medication protocols were established by people who had completed their education, passed their boards, and accumulated the kind of clinical hours that Mariah wouldn't see for another 3 years if she was lucky enough to make it that far. The words had been reasonable, but the tone had been a scalpel, and when Bethany had actually laughed, a short, bright sound like breaking glass, Mariah had felt something inside her chest contract into a space smaller than a fist. She had nodded, apologized for overstepping, and retreated to the supply closet where she had reorganized the same shelf of gauze packages 4 times while trying to remember why she had ever thought she belonged in medicine. The child in room 351 had been fine, of course. The agitation had passed, and Mariah's concern had been filed away in the category of rookie anxiety, the kind of false alarm that trainee nurses generated when they didn't yet understand the difference between clinical observation and emotional projection. Now, looking through the window at Toby Mason's still form, Mariah felt that same uncertainty crawling up her spine, whispering that she should keep her observations to herself, that noticing things beyond her pay grade was a liability rather than an asset. The boy had been unresponsive for 72 hours following a severe asthma attack that had deprived his brain of oxygen for what the neurologist had called a clinically significant duration, which was medical language for damage that might be permanent, might be profound, might mean that the child behind those closed eyelids was already gone. Dr. Chen had been clear in the morning briefing that Toby's prognosis was guarded at best, that the family needed to be prepared for difficult decisions, and that the medical team would continue supportive care while monitoring for any signs of meaningful neurological recovery. The emphasis had been on meaningful. Dr. Chen had a way of loading single words with entire philosophical frameworks, and Mariah had understood that he was drawing a line between the reflexive twitches that meat and nerves could produce and the conscious awareness that made a person still present. She had no reason to doubt him. He had trained at Johns Hopkins, published research on pediatric coma recovery, and carried himself with the kind of quiet certainty that made questioning him feel like questioning gravity itself. But standing here now, watching the way the afternoon light cut through the Venetian blinds and laid stripes across Toby's small face, Mariah felt something pulling at her attention. Something she couldn't name, but also couldn't dismiss. It lived in the space between her clinical training and her human instinct, in the territory that the textbooks didn't map because it couldn't be quantified or replicated in controlled studies. She had felt it yesterday when she had touched the arm of Mrs. Patterson in room 352, an elderly woman recovering from pneumonia who had seemed disoriented and frightened until Mariah had simply sat beside her and held her hand, not saying anything, just being present, and the woman's breathing had slowed and her face had softened, and she had whispered, "Thank you," in a voice so small it might have been imagined. Nobody had taught Mariah that touch could be a form of medicine, that presence could shift something in a patient that medications couldn't reach, but she had felt it happen, had witnessed the unmeasurable thing that occurred when one human being acknowledged the frightened humanity of another. With Toby, she felt that same pull, that same sense that beneath the monitors and the medical certainty, there was something that needed acknowledging, something that was still calling out, even if all the sophisticated equipment said otherwise. The problem was that Mariah had already been laughed at once this week, already been reminded of her place in the hierarchy, and the thought of walking into room 347 and announcing that she felt something the senior physicians had missed was enough to make her stomach twist with anticipatory humiliation. She could already imagine Dr. Chen's face, the way his eyebrows would lift in that expression of professional concern that somehow communicated deep disappointment in her judgment. She could hear Bethany's voice explaining to the other nurses later in the break room, shaking her head over her coffee about the trainee who thought she knew better than a team of specialists, who confused her feelings with clinical assessment, who needed to learn the hard lesson about staying in her lane. Mariah had spent her whole life being too quiet, too uncertain, too willing to defer to people who spoke with confidence, and nursing school had only reinforced that tendency, had taught her that doubt was appropriate for her level. That certainty belonged to those who had earned it through years of study and practice. But standing here with her hand on the door handle, she felt something rising in her that was stronger than her fear of mockery, something that whispered that being wrong about this would hurt less than staying silent and never knowing. She pushed open the door just as Dr. Chen was saying something about adjusting the ventilator settings, and all four physicians turned to look at her with the synchronized attention that made her feel like a specimen under glass. Her voice came out smaller than she had intended, barely more than a whisper, and she had to clear her throat and start again, hating the way her words trembled, even as she forced them out into the sterile air. She said she was here to check Toby's vitals, and Dr. Chen nodded with the distracted permission of someone whose mind was already moving on to more important considerations, and the team returned to their discussion about treatment protocols, while Mariah approached the bed, where 8-year-old Toby Mason lay suspended between life and absence. His skin had the waxy quality of someone who existed only in the care of machines, his chest rising and falling with the mechanical rhythm of the ventilator, his small hands resting on top of the white hospital blanket with a stillness that seemed more profound than simple sleep. The monitors beeped their steady confirmation of a heart that continued to beat and lungs that continued to fill. But there was nothing in the numbers that suggested the boy himself was still present, still capable of choosing to return from wherever the lack of oxygen had taken him. Mariah moved to the side of Toby's bed with the careful quietness that had become her default mode of existence in this hospital, trying to make herself smaller, less intrusive, less likely to draw attention or criticism from the cluster of physicians who continued their clinical discussion at the foot of the bed. She reached for the boy's wrist to check his pulse manually, even though the monitor above his head already displayed his heart rate with digital precision. But she had learned that sometimes the required tasks were less about gathering information and more about performing the ritual of care, demonstrating that she was following protocol even when protocol felt hollow. His skin was cool beneath her fingers, but not cold, not yet carrying the temperature that would signal the body's surrender. And as she pressed gently to find his pulse, she felt something that made her breath catch in her throat, a warmth that seemed to be returning rather than leaving, a subtle shift in the quality of his flesh that suggested blood was flowing with slightly more determination than it had been moments before. It was nothing that would register on a thermometer, nothing that would show up in the continuous monitoring data, but it was there beneath her fingertips like a whisper of intention, and she found herself holding her breath as she tried to decide whether she was sensing something real or simply projecting her desperate hope onto unresponsive tissue. Dr. Chen was explaining to his colleague, Dr. Patricia Vance, that the latest EEG had shown minimal cortical activity, just enough electrical noise to confirm that brain death hadn't occurred, but nowhere near the complex patterns that would indicate consciousness or the possibility of meaningful recovery. His voice had the measured cadence of someone delivering information that had already been processed, analyzed, and filed into the category of clinical facts, and Dr. Vance was nodding with the understanding of someone who had seen this trajectory dozens of times before, who knew that hope at this stage was often cruelty in disguise, that families needed to be guided toward acceptance rather than encouraged to cling to outcomes that statistics rendered nearly impossible. The other two physicians, residents whose names Mariah hadn't yet memorized, were taking notes and asking the kind of sharp, intelligent questions that demonstrated their competence, their readiness to join the ranks of those who made decisions rather than those who merely implemented them. The conversation had the quality of a teaching moment, a case study being constructed in real time, and Toby himself had become less a child and more a collection of systems failing to return to acceptable parameters. But Mariah wasn't listening to their words anymore because something was happening beneath her hand that required all of her attention, every particle of awareness she possessed. As she continued to hold Toby's wrist, checking his pulse with a gentleness that was perhaps more tender than strictly professional, she felt the warmth in his skin intensify just slightly, as if his body was making a decision about whether to invest energy in returning or to let the current stasis become permanent. She shifted her grip, moving her fingers to different points on his forearm, trying to determine if what she was sensing was localized or systemic. And that's when she saw it, a movement so subtle that she almost convinced herself it was a trick of the light, a flutter of his eyelids that lasted less than a second, but was unmistakably intentional. Her heart began hammering against her ribs with such force that she was certain everyone in the room could hear it. But when she glanced at the physicians, they were still engaged in their discussion, still analyzing the boy as if he were already lost, and she realized that this moment was hers alone. This observation that contradicted everything the experts had concluded. She should have announced it immediately, should have interrupted Dr. Chen's explanation to Dr. Vance about the statistical likelihood of recovery given the duration and severity of hypoxia, but something made her hesitate. Some instinct that told her a single eyelid flutter wouldn't be enough to shift medical opinion, would instead be dismissed as a reflexive spasm, a meaningless firing of damaged neurons that signified nothing about consciousness or choice. So instead, she stayed silent, keeping her fingers on Toby's wrist while she watched his face with an intensity that made the rest of the room blur into background noise, waiting to see if the moment would repeat, if the boy would offer more evidence that he was still present beneath the stillness. The monitors continued their steady documentation of vital signs that remained unchanged. The ventilator continued its rhythmic work of breathing for him, and the physicians continued their conversation about when and how to initiate discussions with the family about prognosis and expectations. And Mariah stood there feeling like she was the only person in the room who was actually paying attention to the patient rather than the data. Minutes passed with excruciating slowness, each second expanding to contain her entire awareness of her heartbeat, her breathing, the slight trembling in her hand that she tried to control through sheer force of will. She counted his pulse beats, feeling the steady rhythm that the monitor displayed as 72 beats per minute. But beneath the clinical counting, she was feeling for something else. Some indication that the warmth she had detected was continuing to build, that whatever process was beginning in his body was moving in the direction of return rather than departure. The hospital room smelled of disinfectant and the peculiar plastic scent of medical equipment underlaid with something more human and vulnerable that might have been fear or might have been hope. She couldn't distinguish which. Dr. Chen's voice continued its steady explanation of protocols and procedures, and Mariah realized with a start that he was now discussing the timeline for decision-making, the window within which the family would need to consider whether continuing aggressive intervention was in Toby's best interest. And she felt a surge of something fierce and protective rise in her chest at the idea that they were already planning to let him go. Without fully intending to, she moved her hand from Toby's wrist to his hand, folding her fingers around his small palm in a gesture that wasn't part of any vital check procedure, wasn't something she had been taught in her training, but felt suddenly essential in a way she couldn't articulate or defend. His fingers were limp in hers, unresponsive, and for a moment she felt foolish. Felt like she was exactly the kind of sentimental, emotionally overwrought trainee that the senior staff probably complained about in private, the kind who confused caring with competence and let feelings cloud clinical judgment. But then, just as she was about to release his hand and step back and return to her designated role of invisible observer, she felt something that stopped her breath entirely, the faintest squeeze, a pressure so minimal that it might have been her imagination, except that it came with another flutter of his eyelids, stronger this time, unmistakably deliberate. Her sharp intake of breath must have been audible, because Dr. Chen paused mid-sentence and looked at her with an expression that hovered somewhere between curiosity and irritation. And before she could think better of it, before fear could silence her again, Mariah heard herself say in a voice that shook despite her best efforts to steady it, his eyelids moved, "I think he might be waking up." The silence that followed Mariah's words wasn't the kind of productive, contemplative quiet that preceded careful consideration of new information. It was the stunned, disbelieving pause that comes before someone corrects a fundamental misunderstanding, the moment before authority reasserts itself over foolishness. Dr. Chen's expression shifted from curiosity to something that looked like tired patience, the face of someone who had dealt with countless well-meaning but misguided observations from people who didn't yet understand the difference between hope and evidence. He exchanged a glance with Dr. Vance, a wordless communication that traveled between them with the speed of people who had navigated medical hierarchies long enough to develop their own silent language. And then he walked slowly toward where Mariah stood beside Toby's bed, his approach measured and careful, as if he were dealing with something fragile that might break under too direct an engagement. His voice when he spoke was gentle in the way that authority often is when it wants to soften correction, wants to teach rather than humiliate. But there was steel underneath the kindness, a firmness that made clear this was not a negotiation or even a discussion, but rather an education moment for someone who needed to learn an important lesson about professional boundaries and clinical judgment. He explained that reflexive movements were common in patients with neurological compromise, that the nervous system continued to generate signals even when consciousness was absent, and that what appeared to be purposeful action was often just the misfiring of damaged pathways trying to find routes that no longer existed. His words were delivered with the confidence of someone citing established medical fact, referencing studies and outcomes and the accumulated wisdom of decades of neurology research that had mapped every variation of neural activity and categorized each one according to its significance or lack thereof. Dr. Vance nodded along with his explanation, adding her own observation that trainee nurses often had difficulty distinguishing between their emotional response to a patient's condition and actual clinical changes, that the desire to see improvement could create the illusion of improvement in the absence of objective evidence. One of the residents, a young man with wire-rimmed glasses and the eager expression of someone still trying to prove himself worthy of his position, suggested that perhaps additional education on neurological assessment would be helpful for nursing staff. That understanding the physiological basis of reflexive action versus conscious movement would prevent these kinds of false alarms in the future. Mariah felt heat rising to her cheeks, that particular burning sensation of public humiliation that seemed to radiate from some core deep inside her chest and spread outward until she was certain her face was visibly flushed, marking her embarrassment for everyone in the room to witness and catalogue. She wanted to argue, wanted to insist that what she had felt in Toby's hand and seen in his eyelids wasn't random neural noise, but something intentional, something that carried the signature of a child who was trying to communicate from beneath the weight of whatever darkness had claimed him. But the words stuck in her throat, blocked by years of conditioning that told her to defer to expertise, to assume that people with more education and experience must know better than her frightened instincts and unquantifiable feelings. She found herself nodding, apologizing in a voice that came out smaller than a whisper, saying she understood, she had made a mistake. She would be more careful about distinguishing between observation and wishful thinking. And even as the words left her mouth, she hated herself for speaking them, hated the part of her that would rather be wrong and silent than right and ridiculed. Dr. Chen patted her shoulder with the kind of paternal gesture that was probably meant to be reassuring, but felt instead like a dismissal, a way of physically moving her back into her proper place in the hierarchy of the room. He told her it was natural to want to see improvement, that caring about patients was what made good nurses good, but that clinical detachment was equally important, that emotions needed to be balanced with evidence-based assessment if they were going to provide the best possible care. His words made sense in the abstract, contained the kind of wisdom that would probably sound profound if she encountered them in a textbook or heard them in a lecture hall. But standing there beside Toby's bed, with the memory of that squeeze still alive in her palm, they felt like gaslighting, like being told that her own perception of reality couldn't be trusted, that her senses were subordinate to machines and medical consensus. The other physicians had already returned to their discussion, moving on from the interruption as if it had been nothing more than a minor distraction, a speed bump on the road to the conclusions they had already reached, and Mariah found herself wondering if this was what it meant to become a nurse, to learn to ignore your instincts in favor of protocols, to let your human responses be overruled by systems that could measure everything except the unmeasurable. She started to step back from the bed, to retreat into the invisibility that was her safest position in this space, but something made her hand linger on Toby's. Some stubborn refusal to surrender what she had felt even if she couldn't defend it in language that would satisfy medical authority. The boy's face remained still, his eyelids closed, his breathing entirely dependent on the machine that expanded and contracted his lungs with mechanical precision, and she wondered if she had imagined everything. If the senior physicians were right, and she was simply another rookie projecting her desires onto a situation that had already been accurately assessed and categorized. But then she felt it again, stronger this time, unmistakable in its presence. His fingers pressed against her palm with deliberate pressure, a squeeze that lasted long enough that she could count 3 distinct pulses of intentional contact, and simultaneously his eyelids fluttered with increasing intensity, moving beneath the closed lids as if he were dreaming or struggling toward wakefulness. And this time she didn't hesitate, didn't pause to consider whether she would be believed or mocked. Her voice came out louder than before, cutting across Dr. Chen's explanation to Dr. Vance about family counseling protocols, sharp enough that all 4 physicians stopped mid-conversation and turned to stare at her with expressions ranging from confusion to outright annoyance. She said again that his hand was squeezing hers, that his eyelids were moving, that something was happening that the monitors weren't detecting, but that she could feel and see with absolute certainty. And this time there was no tremor in her voice, no apology in her tone. Just flat declarative statement that demanded attention, even if it also demanded consequences. Dr. Chen's face shifted from patient educator to something harder, something that carried the weight of professional authority being questioned by someone who had no standing to question it. And when he spoke, his voice had lost its gentle overlay, had become clipped and precise in the way that communicated controlled irritation. He informed her that reflexive hand movements and rapid eye movement beneath closed lids were both well-documented phenomena in patients with severe brain injury that neither indicated conscious awareness or volitional control, and that continuing to insist otherwise was not only medically incorrect, but potentially harmful to the family who needed accurate information rather than false hope, built on misinterpretation of normal physiological processes. The other physicians were no longer just watching with curiosity. Dr. Vance had crossed her arms in a posture that communicated defensive judgment, and the residents were exchanging glances that Mariah recognized as the social bonding that occurs when a group witnesses someone making a serious professional error, the kind of shared understanding that would be discussed later in private conversations about the trainee who wouldn't let go of her delusion even when multiple specialists explained her mistake. Bethany, who had somehow materialized in the doorway, let out that same bright laugh that Mariah remembered from yesterday. And this time it was joined by a comment delivered in a stage whisper to Marcus, who stood beside her. Something about how some people were too emotional for clinical work, how nursing required a certain toughness that not everyone possessed. And Mariah felt something inside her chest crack under the combined weight of professional dismissal and social humiliation. She opened her mouth to apologize again, to retreat and surrender, and accept that she had been wrong, that her instincts were untrustworthy, and her observations were worthless. But before she could form the words, before she could complete her capitulation to authority and consensus, Toby's eyes opened fully and looked directly at her face. and the entire room descended into a shocked silence so profound that even the monitor alarms seemed to dim in the face of what they were witnessing. Time fractured into something non-linear in that moment, stretching and compressing simultaneously so that Mariah experienced both the infinite expansion of recognition and the instantaneous collapse of every certainty that had governed the room just seconds before. Toby's eyes were open, fully, unmistakably open, and they were looking at her with a focus that transcended the mechanical responses Dr. Chen had described, a consciousness that was clearly present and clearly choosing where to direct its attention in its first moments of return. His pupils contracted slightly as they adjusted to the light, a reflexive biological response that was nonetheless accompanied by something that wasn't reflexive at all, something that lived in the quality of his gaze, in the way his eyes tracked her face with what could only be described as recognition or perhaps gratitude, as if he had been calling out from some dark interior space and she had been the only one who heard him. The monitors began registering changes that had been invisible moments before. His heart rate increased from 72 to 85 beats per minute. His blood pressure ticked upward by several points, subtle shifts in the data that suddenly seemed to validate everything Mariah had been sensing but couldn't prove. Dr. Chen stood frozen in a posture of transition, caught between his movement toward dismissing her and his realization that something fundamental had shifted in the clinical picture he had so confidently assessed just moments earlier. His face cycled through a series of expressions that would have been almost comical if the situation weren't so charged with emotional weight. Confusion giving way to disbelief, giving way to cautious professional interest, his mind clearly working to recategorize what he was witnessing, to fit this unexpected development into some framework that would preserve his previous assessment while accommodating new evidence. Dr. Vance moved quickly to the other side of the bed, her earlier dismissive posture abandoned in favor of focused clinical attention, checking Toby's pupil response with a pen light she produced from her coat pocket, asking him in a loud, clear voice whether he could hear her, whether he knew where he was, whether he could follow simple commands like squeezing her hand or moving his fingers. The residents scrambled for their notebooks, suddenly aware that they were witnessing something that would become part of their clinical education, a case study in unexpected recovery that would challenge their assumptions about prognosis and the reliability of neurological assessment. But Toby wasn't looking at any of them, wasn't responding to Dr. Vance's questions or the pen light being shined in his eyes, or the sudden flurry of medical attention that surrounded him like a swarm of urgent moths. His gaze remained fixed on Mariah, and when Dr. Vance tried to guide his face toward her for a proper neurological examination, he resisted with the small but determined strength of a child who knows what he wants and isn't willing to be redirected, his neck muscles tensing against her gentle pressure, his eyes seeking out the trainee nurse who stood beside him, with tears now streaming freely down her face, unashamed and unwiped. Salt water that carried the accumulated weight of being dismissed and doubted and proven, right in a way that felt both triumphant and terrifying. She wanted to speak, to say something reassuring or comforting to the boy who had just returned from wherever he had been, but her voice had abandoned her entirely, fled in the face of overwhelming emotion that threatened to crack her open completely if she didn't find some way to contain it. Dr. Chen found his professional voice first, stepping forward to take control of the situation with the practiced efficiency of someone who had managed countless medical emergencies and unexpected developments over his decades of practice. He began issuing orders to the residents, requesting immediate neurological consultation, asking for updated EEG and CT scan protocols, instructing someone to contact the family immediately and inform them of the change in their son's condition, his voice steady and authoritative, as if he hadn't just spent the last 10 minutes explaining why recovery was statistically improbable and clinically unlikely. The residents moved with purposeful urgency, grateful perhaps to have concrete tasks that allowed them to contribute to this moment rather than simply witness it. And within seconds, the room had transformed from a space of resigned assessment into a hub of active intervention, everyone suddenly invested in supporting and documenting Toby's return. But even as the medical machine reorganized itself around this new reality, even as protocols and procedures reasserted themselves over surprise, Mariah noticed that none of them acknowledged what had actually happened. None of them spoke aloud the fact that she had been right, that her supposedly emotional and clinically worthless observation had preceded by several minutes what the sophisticated equipment and expert analysis had missed entirely. She felt Toby's hand tighten around hers again, a squeeze that was stronger now, more insistent, and when she looked down at his face, she saw that his lips were moving, trying to form words around the ventilator tube that still occupied his throat. Sounds that couldn't quite emerge, but that carried clear intention nonetheless. Dr. Vance noticed the movement and immediately began the process of assessing whether he was ready for extubation, checking his oxygen saturation and respiratory effort, conferring quickly with Dr. Chen about the protocols for removing artificial breathing support from a patient who had just emerged from a prolonged state of unresponsiveness. The decision was made with impressive speed, both physicians apparently agreeing that leaving the tube in place when the patient was clearly conscious and attempting to communicate would be more traumatic than any risk associated with early removal. And within minutes, the ventilator was disconnected and the tube was being gently extracted, a procedure that made Toby gag and cough, but that also freed his voice, allowed him to make sounds that were weak and raspy, but unmistakably human, unmistakably his own. The first word he spoke, once his airway was clear and he could draw breath without mechanical assistance, wasn't "Mom" or "Where am I?" or any of the disoriented questions that might be expected from someone emerging from 3 days of unconsciousness. Instead, he looked directly at Mariah and whispered in a voice that was barely audible, but that somehow carried through the sudden stillness of the room, "You heard me." The words landed with the weight of accusation and gratitude combined, a statement that seemed to contain entire volumes of experience that the medical team had no vocabulary for, no way to measure or document in their charts and assessments. Mariah's throat closed around a sob that she refused to release in front of the physicians who had mocked her, and she managed to nod, to squeeze his hand back in acknowledgement that yes, she had heard him, even when everyone else had been certain there was nothing to hear, even when the evidence said he was absent and the experts said she was projecting. Dr. Chen and Dr. Vance exchanged another of their wordless glances, this one carrying a different freight than the earlier look of professional solidarity, perhaps containing some small seed of recognition that something had occurred here that didn't fit neatly into their framework of clinical understanding. But whatever thoughts passed between them remained unspoken, folded into the ongoing work of examining and documenting Toby's neurological status, now that he had decided to contradict their predictions by returning.